Coogs House. All right, so now we finally know who we're playing on Friday night. Let's look at them.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Anches, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way we can get the latest on the Cougs in your newsfeed each and every day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. It's good to see you again. Remember, we're doing a giveaway every 250 subscribers. The next one of those is at 1,000. So hit subscribe to help us get there faster, and then comment and like the video so we know that you're entered into the contest. If you have nothing else to say after we talk some about the Miami Hurricane basketball team and how that matchup will look kind of in a preliminary sense, I don't know, tell us what you put on your baked potato. So in this episode, we're going to do a lot of looking at Miami, both the game they just played against Indiana to move on to the Sweet 16 and talk a little bit about that matchup. And then we'll move into talking some about what they do well on a more like average basis and look at kind of like how their year has gone. I am working on securing some sort of a Miami Hurricane creator to have on and talk more about their season from a whole later this week. A couple go-tos had busy weeks with their spring practices and stuff like that going on. And Miami, I think, even though they're in the Sweet 16 back-to-back years, cares more about the football stuff than the basketball stuff. So we're working on finding some guys to fill in some roles and holes for that. But today's episode is going to be a preliminary look and first glances. I got some notes I took on that game that just happened. Actually, this page is mostly blank. This is where the notes were. But we're going to talk about that one in the first segment. In the second segment, again, talk more about their season as a whole as it looks. And the third segment, stuff to look out for the Cougs. So first, let's talk about this game. Miami was in control of this game in a way that I think if you weren't Houston, might have you worried, right? Houston, I don't think has any cause to be concerned too terribly much. But Miami jumped out the gates early and was up by 13 under 10 minutes in the first half, right? And kind of rode that for a while. And it looked like Miami was going to put this thing away really, really early. And then at halftime, or just before halftime, I should say, Indiana cut it to 5. They have a couple pro guys in the Hood Schifino and Trace Jackson Davis. Anyway, they put those kind of guys kind of in spots to score more one-on-one situations in the end of the first half, cut the lead to 5, and actually had the lead briefly at the start of the second half. Teams played kind of evenly for a few minutes, and then Miami started their run at like the 11.5-minute mark and never really looked back. I guess it got to double digits pretty quickly. That was, again, like 11.5 minutes. Less than 3 minutes later, Miami is up by 10 and then 12 and then 10 and kind of continues to be flirting around that. They had a flurry of threes at the end of the game that made it even more dramatic. And then when Indiana went to a press, it was kind of, that was, I guess, one last Hail Mary try and make that thing work out for them. But at the end of the day, Miami was ready for the press. Miami is led by good guard play, and while we'll talk about them more later in the show, they showed out in this game. The impressive efforts to me as I watched this game, obviously things look like they start and end with a kid named Isaiah Wong. He was 4 of 6 from behind the arc. He had 27 points. He played 36 minutes. He broke the press single-handedly. He finished the ball without the ball. If someone else broke the press, he's a tremendous, tremendous guard. And he had a really, really good game against Indiana because Indiana did not have anyone look like they keep in front of him. Now, Isaiah Wong is 6'4", 185, so kind of a bigger guard, but does like to bring the ball up, is a creator in that sense. In this game, he did not have an assist, but it does not look like that is his MO. I don't mean to say that he is like a guy that drops a bunch of dimes. He does have about 3.5 assists a game, right? So in this game, he was kind of like we talked about Tremont Mark in our round of 32 game, all attack mode all the time, not looking to dish it off. And frankly, he exploited a matchup that I thought, kudos to him for doing so. Other guys that I think stood out in this game were their big fella. Now, I was surprised to see that Norshad Omier did not have a double-double. He, I guess, finished with 7 points, but he had 17 rebounds. And seeing him control so many rebounds made me think he had to have a double-double. Like, you have to have a couple putbacks at some point, right? But he did not. He had just 7 points, 17 rebounds, though, and 8 of them were offensive. He was a Houston Cougar type basketball player out there, the way he was chasing down balls and deflections and getting hands to the ball, tips and those kind of things. So Houston is going to be kind of playing at least one guy that's kind of up to the task in that sense, it looks like. To be fair, in looking at Indiana, Trace Jackson Davis is a pro, and I don't mean this to say like he can't do things or whatever. He did not look up to the same energy test. Neither did like Miller Kopp or Miller Kopp shot at Houston Christian High School. Like he wasn't up to the same kind of energy task. That wasn't necessarily their strength. And Norshad Omier kind of just out athleted them to a lot of basketballs and out efforted them to a lot of basketballs. I don't think he'll do that to Houston, but he certainly did that to Indiana. And so that was a big, big plug for them. The other kid I was impressed with as far as like the way that they run their things is Jordan Miller. Jordan Miller is a 6'7". He's listed as a forward, but he does a lot of different things. He's okay and comfortable with the ball beyond the perimeter. I don't believe he hit a 3 in this game, so I mean to say he's a shooter from out there. Let me check to see if he's a good shooter on the season from out there. 35% on 2.5 attempts a game. So doesn't shoot a whole lot of times, which would kind of throw the percentage up a little bit, right? But I will say, interestingly enough, that like he was super comfortable with the ball outside. Quick moves, put on the ground, get the rack, that kind of stuff. Miami did a good job of creating space in this game. In this game, they were a 5-out team, and what they ran was what I call 2 different actions, meaning they have like a dribble handoff on one side and then the double pin down the other side, or a traditional pick and roll on this side and flare screen on the other. Like the constant action with all of it being outside of the 3-point line led to, bluntly, not a lot of guys in the paint to play help defense, because you're being occupied in the backside action. So you can't go tag the roller or whatever because you're tied up in some sort of a backside action, worried about whatever. Now, Sampson will see this and diagnose it. And it's so, in looking at Houston's past opponents and like teams that do things that look like what Miami did to Indiana, obviously both Indiana and Miami are much better than Tulsa, but Tulsa did a lot of the same things. I remember like in the Tulsa game, they had like a big man that was like weave, roll, like 5-out kind of actions. Team that was a lot better when Alabama went to their bench unit, right? The thing that kind of threw Houston off was Houston didn't have in the scouting report because it was their bench unit. We talked about that way back in the gap, right? Like that would threw Houston off because they weren't ready for it. Houston ought to be ready for it this time because they've seen it on tape and know kind of what their rules are and who to help off of where and those kinds of things. And Houston's really, really good at game planning those kinds of actions. But those would be the 2 teams that stick out as like the most vivid memories of that. If you've got one that sticks out in your head, tell us down below. We want to talk more about Miami's season as a whole and what they look like as they head towards Kansas City to play Houston on Friday. But first, let's talk some about our buddies at FanDuel. Now, FanDuel is the #1 sports book in America, and it is the like grind time of the NBA season. It's grind time of the NBA season, and it's March Madness. There's all the basketball all the time. The tournament is heating up, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. It's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use, and you can bet on everything from point scores to threes drained. Now, as of the recording of this, they do not have, let me double check one more time, but they do not have a line set for Houston versus Miami. I do think it's interesting that on the other side of our region, you have Xavier playing UT Austin, and that line is set at just 3.5 points, and the over-under set pretty high at 148. If you want to put some money in that one, I really think this is going to be a close game. It's going to come down to me how UT Austin shoots from behind the arc and how they look from out there. If you're going to go look at that one is at just plus 3.5. The one I really want to look at, though, is in the NBA. The Rockets are an interesting team to bet on right now, kind of because they're playing well but not winning, right? And so when they play the Golden State Warriors at home, The Warriors are favored by 9.5 points, but the Warriors have been awful on the road. And frankly, for large chunks of the season, they've looked as bad on the road as the Houston Rockets have. And so I think 9.5 points is a lot of points in that window. I'm taking Houston to be closer than 9.5 points. We've seen them win 3 of the last 4, play pretty competitive basketball. Jalen Green going off for 40 and stuff like that. Jabari Smith knocking down game winners. I'm thinking 9.5 points is too big a gap. And I'm telling you to do all of this: college basketball, men's side, women's side, NBA. You want to start looking at MLB spring futures, those kind of stuff. I want you to do all of that at FanDuel, because FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet for up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so in looking at Miami some, I got to admit, I was intrigued. I didn't watch a whole heck of a lot of them this season. I watched some ACC basketball, I admit, and I think I actually did see them play Virginia this season. But I went back and looked at how Miami did in ACC play because, honestly, I think it was easy for a lot of us to write off the year as a down ACC year, right? Because it was not a Duke year. It was not a Carolina year. Virginia even obviously stumbled early in the tournament and had some ups and downs this season, right? It didn't feel like a traditional ACC year. And that may have been because it's not, but also may have been because it was kind of Miami's year in the regular season for the ACC. I looked at common opponents. There were 2 common opponents that they played. Houston plays UCF twice a year. Obviously, they played Miami in the preseason. Houston beat UCF by 6 at home and 11 on the road, because that's how we do things. Apparently, Miami was able to beat UCF by 2 in Central Florida. So, like, competitive road game. But interesting that Houston beat UCF by 11 at their place. So anyway, back and forth there. The other common opponent obviously was that Virginia team. They don't play 2 games because the conference is so big in the ACC. So they only played once, and Miami won by 2 at home. You'll obviously remember that was a big game for Houston. Houston won by 8 on the road in the same matchup. So Houston's got what looks like, if the transitive property were working anything outside of math, and I do teach history, but I think that is transitive property. Houston's got an advantage in what looks like those kinds of aspects. The other thing that's interesting here is that this game, as far as Houston versus Miami goes, will kind of be dictated by who controls the pace, because they both play at a really different pace. This is going to be like either one of the teams going to feel really out of sorts at some point in this game based on how this goes. I look at common opponents and think that Houston will dictate the pace and keep it a little bit slower, right? The average pace of play across all of college basketball means the middle of the 363 teams is 67 possessions per game. Houston plays well below that at 63 possessions per game. Now, that only feels like a couple possessions, but you realize that, like, then you multiply how many turnovers Houston forces and all, like, oh, that starts taking away a lot of those, right? On the flip side, Miami plays at 69, almost 70 possessions per game, right? And so that's just a little bit higher, and the same kind of math happens there. They want to play a little bit faster pace. While neither one of those is so horribly far off of the average, the window there is pretty strong and pretty big, and who controls which way they lean or which way the game leans could determine the outcome of the game. I have faith that Houston does it. Houston, we both know, will take long possessions on offense and wind down to the last 8 seconds and find some way to get a post touch and score, or a step back from Sasser, or just a downhill from, or whatever, right? And I have a lot of confidence that they'll fluster Miami into taking long possessions and questionable shots. What I was interested in looking at Miami's season average things is in watching that Indiana game and in looking at their numbers, I was like, oh, crap, these guys shoot the skin off the ball from behind the arc. And in a lot of ways, they do. They shoot almost 37% from 3. That is, let me double check my numbers to be sure here. That is 39th in the country from behind the arc. That is a really, really good percentage from behind the arc. However, in how many 3-pointers they shoot just over 23s per game, which is 230th in the country, right? So they shoot the ball really, really well from behind the arc. They just don't do it often. And in putting numbers together, along with what we've seen on tape against the Indiana team, what is happening there is they've got a lot of guards and guys comfortable behind the arc on the floor. But the goal is clearly spread you out and attack the rim and get 2-point field goals, not those 3-point field goals. And credit to Larrañaga, the coach there's been there like 12 years. Cuban American leading the program in Miami, kind of building it up. Like very, very cool story there for another time. We'll talk about it after we end their season, right? But cool story there for them. But it's an interesting back and forth where you see teams that shoot as well as they do from three and think, man, that team must be killing everybody from behind the arc. And the truth is, they shoot like 7.5 out of 20 from behind the arc per game. And that is a high percentage, but it is not like a lot of points from behind the arc. In fact, on their percentage of points that they score from behind the arc, they score just under 29% of their points from behind the arc. That is in the almost the last 100 of college basketball as far as percentage of points scored from out that far away, which is just counterintuitive for a team you see with all those guards. But for how they play, then you think about like what they did to Indiana, it's because all those guards are attacking off the bounce, right? And that's going to challenge Houston in a lot of ways, especially if they start reaching, getting foul calls like they did at times in the round of 32 game with Auburn, right? When they start putting hands on guys on drivers and stuff like that. What it could also mean is you could see some zone out of Houston, right? You could see some zone, that 32 zone that they do so well, and force Miami to really test that 3-point line a little bit because they have to get in the lane. They'll have bodies in the lane. They got to kick it out, right? They kind of tore up when Indiana ran a zone, but Indiana doesn't have two bigs back there that are as athletic as the guys Houston rolls out. They got one, right? I mean, they don't have one. And I think Trace Jackson Davis impressed me a lot, and he did impress me a lot. I think he impressed a lot of people with draft stuff in that game. But that's just one of the posts back there. I would think with both Jarace and Jawan, and then you throw in Reggie or whatever you got going on in the back line of that zone, I would think that's enough activity to throw someone off. I also wonder if you go more like a 2-3 zone with Javier in there in the middle, although we've seen less and less of that from the Cougs this season. The other stylistic thing I want to point about Miami 4 in the third segment, we will get into more of their like individual player breakdown kind of stuff on the season, getting familiar with them some, is they run a like 5-man rotation. It's not quite 5 men, but guys like Miller and Wong don't come off the floor. Like they are both nationally ranked how many minutes they play per game kind of guys, right? Like they keep a pretty tight rotation. So unlike like Auburn, this is a Power 5 team. They get athletes and right? Houston's got athletes, but all I mean to say is I'm not going to downgrade any other AAC team right now, but it's not a typical American Conference team where like that 7th, 8th athlete's a whole lot different athlete. They have a lot of athletes. They just don't play them as often as like Auburn was really eager to get deep in their bench, right? They played some guys like 8 minutes in the game, right? That like that's not really what Miami's doing a whole lot unless they blow the lids off and are beating somebody a whole lot of points. And on the whole, I'm not super concerned with Miami. They're a relatively short team, so they're not going to outsize Houston. They out-efforted Indiana and out-hustled Indiana and out-athleted Indiana. I don't think they do that, knock on wood. I don't think they do that to Houston either. The way I could see this happening is if Houston tries to take away things they do well and they get hot from behind the arc, because they do shoot the ball well out there. If they just start finally shooting a lot of them, Houston could be in a little bit of trouble as far as like recovering and like what's the, what kind of, left turns do you make here and what kind of halftime adjustments do you make and what's the game like at halftime. We know Houston's a second half team, so I'm sure they'll be down the first half and we'll hear and the sky will be falling on a bunch of people's sort of profiles and the second half will open up and we'll hear all about how that all went away again really fast, right? Now, in the third segment, I do want to talk some about personnel matchups. So let's jump into what that will look like. Again, they start and play a handful of guys and don't dig into the beach a whole heck of a lot. Isaiah Wong and Jordan Miller are their two bell cow type of guys as far as those minutes go. In the Indiana game, they each played 36 minutes. On the season, let me make sure I get this stat correct because I don't want to be wrong because I don't want people to correct me online. They're playing 33 and 34 minutes or 34 and a half minutes per game, respectively, right? So like they're playing a lot of the basketball game, a lot like how Sasser and Shed take over a lot of the basketball game for Houston. The difference here is just that Miller is a 6'7" guy, so he's more like the Juwan Roberts, probably close to Jarace Walker role. He's not Jarace, but you feel me, right? Norchad Omier, for reference, plays like he's their hustle man that I was likening to like Juwan Roberts. He's playing like 28 minutes per game, although in the Indiana game, he played 26 minutes. He had 3 fouls, so we missed some time early, but would reference that means he had 17 rebounds in 26 minutes. That's the kind of effort we're getting out of that guy on the floor when he's out there. And again, he's typically more like a double-double. He just didn't quite break the 10-point mark in that Indiana game. Nigel Pack, I guess, is a guy worth mentioning as well. He is a double-digit scorer typically, and he did break 10 against Indiana, but he seems to be playing off of other people's creation a whole lot, and then he also will benefit from if they beat you off the bounce and you scramble in rotation, he can attack a like offset defense in a way that isn't necessarily a lead ball guy, but it didn't appear to be that way. We'll watch more tape, obviously, and grind over the course of the week, but it'll be interesting to see how Houston attacks him or Houston goes with him. Wooga Poplar, I think is how you pronounce the name. If I'm not pronouncing that correctly, tell me in the comments down below. But Wooga Poplar, he played just 18 minutes in the Indiana game. Now, he does typically play a little bit more, like 24, 25 minutes per game, looks like, across their game logs. However, he had a pretty bad-looking back injury. Went up for a layup, got undercut, and it fell right on his tailbone on the ground really hard, and was still limping around a few minutes later. That's the kind of tailbone injuries are weird. They can be the kind of thing where, like, you're good in a couple days. They're the kind of thing where, hey, you put a McDavid, football girdle on with a little butt pad and you're okay. And they'd be the kind of thing where you don't play for a month. I don't know what the injury will be like that. What's interesting to me is that would actually shift how Houston defends them, because Poplar is the guy I intuitively think Tremont Mark would guard. Similar athlete, similar skill sets as far as like things that Tremont does well defensively. Like, I think that's a natural matchup there. But if he's not like healthy and going, and you see Anthony Walker starting, first of all, that'd be a huge shift. Anthony Walker is their first guy off the bench, plays a lot of minutes off the bench for them. And he's like 6'9", 215, right? And so that throws like, oh crap. Then you have to put Jarace there. And so then when you have to move people around suddenly, right? If you, for reference, I think you'd put Jarace on Anthony Walker, and then you'd probably put Tremont on Jordan Miller. And that'd be my intuitive first thought, but I digress. That if they start somewhere else, I guess we'll see where that goes. But Miami's dealt with a bunch of injuries since ACC. I almost said AAC, since ACC play. And so I'm sure they've got some sort of a backup card in their back pocket. The other guy they pulling off the bench some is a kid named Harlan Beverly. Harlan Beverly is kind of a junkyard dog type of guard, if that makes any sense. He's like tough and scrappy and does the dirty work as a guard. He's not particularly scary in any single skill set, but he's a guy that I understand why Miami plays him for, let me double check this, for the 14, 15 minutes a game that they do, right? Like, he's the seventh man in a rotation that is about 7 men, and I get why he plays as much as he does. I already mentioned Anthony Miller, but Anthony Miller is an interesting guy off the bench. He's a big-time energy guy at 6'9". So if he comes in off the bench, gets a couple dunks, it's like, oh, man, we're going crazy. And that's kind of the way Miami goes. Now, admittedly, I threw out to Twitter online, who would y'all rather play in this game? And results were kind of split. Some people wanted to play Indiana because thought Indiana looked worse. Some people didn't want to play Indiana because they didn't want to hear about Sampson, Indiana all week on the media stuff. Some people wanted to play in Miami because they wanted to see, I don't know, guards versus guards and see a good game. Some people didn't want to see Miami because they don't want to see guys that are going side to side that fast, or see the pace difference or whatever, right? I think Houston beats both teams. I do think it's interesting that as Houston is moving up into the bigger and bigger time here, the 6:15 Central Time tip on Friday will be the first time Houston has played Miami since 1971. Now, I have not found that 1971 box score, but on Sports Reference, I did find the score. Just it wasn't a clickable link to go to a box score. Houston won 99-93 in Miami, for what it's worth. So, keep riding the streak there, I guess. And I think it's interesting that, like, it was the first time that Sampson's ever played Auburn just 2 days ago. And it is now going to be the first time we played Miami as a franchise or as a program in 50, 60, 50 years. Like, you're starting to see, as Houston's moving up into an elevated place in basketball, them do things and get to do things they haven't done before and seeing faces and programs and logos and stuff that you haven't ever seen before. And I think that's appropriate. Houston is moving into an era of basketball program that force rate 216s is no laughing matter. Like, as you move into the best conference in college basketball, having that resume proves you're worthy and you're moving up in the world as a program. Obviously, a lot more time to talk about that after the season's over. We'll be hopefully looking back on some trophies and rings and nets and all of that. So we'll talk about that later. But for now, make sure you subscribe down below. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Make sure you subscribe, though, so you make Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day every day. This week, I need it before I close out the show to say is a little funky. We do have to go to a funeral in my family this week. And so we're kind of doing like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, taking our like typical weekend, like Wednesday, Thursday, and then coming back with some on Friday. We'll see what kind of episodes we get out when and there. But admittedly, traveling to a funeral in Cleveland, Ohio, and things getting thrown off, and family comes first sometimes, right? So we're doing that a little bit. Recording in the middle of the week will be a little funky. We'll be back by the weekend, I promise. And we'll do all kinds of fun stuff with the Sweet 16 Elite 8 and so on after that. Thank you all so much for tuning in the show, and thank you all so much for understanding as well. Make sure to subscribe down below, comment, thumbs up so we know you like it. You can follow me at Painsworth512, PAINSWRTH512 on Twitter, Instagram, and all of your social media handles. I'll be happy to talk all things Houston Cougars, the Rockets, Astros about to start up. The Altuve thing's kind of scary, but also like fun to talk about. Everyone's got like their own perspective there. Lots of fun things going on with Houston sports. As far as conversations go, I don't want to make injury sound fun. Also, make sure if you're looking for a second listen of the day, you're looking for Locked On College Basketball. It is March Madness. It is the most fun time of the year in college sports. So make sure you go check out Locked On College Basketball. It's a national daily college basketball show, very Cougar friendly as well. And they do 7 days a week these days, looking at all things college hoops. Make sure you check out Andy and Isaac over there. They're doing a great job. Remember, Locked On Cougs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team, or in our case, number one team in the country, every day. Go Cougs.